In the mid-1950s, a cultural explosion took place that would define the decade like nothing that had come before it, throwing young women into a frenzy and setting the world on its ear. And it had a name.
Elvis Presley.
Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley.
He was the world's biggest superstar, a king both in name and in lifestyle.
I was getting used to the movie star bitch, you know. I had dark glasses on, sitting in the back of the Cadillac limousine. I'm a movie star. I'm a zombie. Hey. So I did that, you know. I was living with that man, and I got drafted. So overnight, it was all gone, man. It was like it was a dream, you know. I was like, was that me? Did it happen?
I got those 1, 2, 3, 4 occupation GI Blue. 1, 2, 3. From my GI hair to the heels of my GI shoes.
Well, since my baby left me, well, I found a new place to dwell.
In 1956, when a young truck driver named Elvis Presley burst onto the rock and roll map with his single Heartbreak Hotel, the teenagers of the world had finally found their touchstone.
Well, I was so lonely I could die.
A rock and roll god whose mannerisms and style boys would copy for generations to come, and whose suggestive eyes and rolling hips would send millions of young women into spasms of delight and their parents into a frenzy of disapproval.
That's a phenomenal thing. You know, this was a global phenomena in the way that it changed every kid's life, every boy's life, not to mention every girl's life. The idea of just looking like Elvis, whether you did or not, became very important. And your hair became his hair, you know. And if you didn't have the right hair, it was not going to happen. And whoever did got the women, you know.
There were a lot of girls and boys and men and women, and they would rush him. And sure, anybody, I would be worried and concerned about that because he could get hurt. And he may have gotten hurt some of the time. I mean, I think they jerked his shirts off and things like this, you know, grabbing for him.
These men come down here from New York and from Florida to find out my reasons on rock and roll music and why I preach against it, and I believe with all of my heart. If you talk to the average teenager of today and you ask them what it is about rock and roll music that they like, and the first thing they'll say is the beat, the beat, the beat.
We thought he had way too many girls clamoring around at that time. The excitement of knowing that you're doing well and that people like him, it's rewarding. At the same time, it's kind of okay, that time is up now, let me take him and go home. Yeah. And that didn't happen.
But in 1958, Elvis faced an even bigger threat to his standing as the nation's foremost rebel.
Congratulations, you are now in the Army. You're all privates. That's the way you'll be addressed from now on.
The United States government had seen fit to embrace Elvis Presley in the only way it could, by drafting him into its army.
We all saw him off, and his mom was there, and his dad, and some other fans were there, and he hugged me last. And I was trying not to cry because I did not want him to see me leave crying. You know, I was trying to smile. It was hard. It was difficult. I could not, my heart was being just torn away. And it was very hard to see him leave.
When he did get his notice, I'm sure he was not too happy. I mean, when you think you're the biggest star in the world at the time, and all of a sudden the Army says, hey, we want you. I mean, you can't feel too good.
Elvis Presley no longer has that rock and roll beat. The tempo is 1, 2, 3, 4 for Private Presley. He's at Camp Chaffee, Arkansas, beginning his 2-year Army hitch courtesy of the Memphis Draft Board. Like any ex-civilian raw recruit, the king of rock and roll will be keeping time to non-hip bugle calls. Involuntarily retired, the gyrating guitarist's departure from the public eye left his blue jean fans all shook up, so we hear. But Elvis doesn't seem to mind at all.
Elvis's induction was more than just news to the American public. It was prime time entertainment.
Elvin Pelvin drafted. Rock and roll idol to be GI. Elvin sent to Fort Dix under guard.
In the days before his induction, as parents all over the country looked on gleefully at the process that would take away their children's idol for the next 2 years, that idol was readying himself for what was to be one of the most traumatic days in his young life. He had already decided to rob the press and public alike of at least one vicarious thrill associated with his new status as America's foremost draftee: the shearing of the famous greasy Presley locks into a regulation Army crew cut.
I don't know if Elvis has haircut before in the Army because I didn't know him before then, okay? But it looked like he did. Knowing him, he probably had a nice, clean, little shorter haircut than normal, than having to cut so much off from one extreme to another so much. And he probably did that. Knowing Elvis, he thought about those kinds of things. He knew he was going to be filmed and videoed. He's got to make sure he looks good on camera.
Elvis spent the 3 days after his formal induction at Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, where he was given his various inoculations, his uniform and duffel bag, his Army aptitude tests, and most importantly, his eagerly awaited and long-dreaded 65-cent haircut. He also gave his first ever salute to a battery of cameras that had been allowed to follow him through the induction process due to the arrangements of Colonel Tom Parker.
Elvis being drafted, I thought it was very unusual because, you know, I figured a big star like him would never get drafted in the service, but he did. And I think Colonel was smart. He's saying, hey, go do your 2 years. I'll keep your name out there and interest in you, and don't do special services because they're going to come after you to do special service. Serve your 2 years. And it was a great move.
From Arkansas, Elvis was transported to Fort Hood, Texas, where he began his basic training with A Company, 2nd Tank Battalion, 2nd Armored Division. Though Elvis was taking all of this in decidedly good public humor, behind closed doors and away from the press, he was truly miserable. He had gone from the sumptuous confines and safe haven of Graceland to a numbered bunk in a barracks with dozens of other faceless and nameless recruits. Though his array of cars would be waiting for him in the civilian world, he now had to make do with a regulation Army Jeep. And as for his obsession with clothes, the Army would see to it that he would be dressed in the finest olive drab that money could buy. Though Elvis's transformation from worldwide superstar to buck private was not fun for the young rock and roller, it was tolerable. There was, however, at least one person upon whom the entire affair would have a devastating effect. Gladys Presley had always been her son's #1 fan, friend, and confidant in the years leading up to his emergence as the most powerful performer the world had ever seen. And the prospect of being separated from him for 2 long years was more than she could bear. With Elvis gone, first to his career demands and now to his Army training, Gladys increasingly relied on alcohol as a means of coping with this latest crisis in her life. Though most people would have seen Graceland as the culmination of a lifelong dream, to Gladys Presley, it was a gilded prison that removed her from the places and people she found most familiar by creating a social wall around her, which would be impossible to climb. While Elvis's hordes of fans desperately longed to enter the gates of the antebellum mansion, Gladys wanted nothing more than to leave them and Elvis's fame behind her forever. As her sister Lillian later put it, a woman from the hills of Mississippi is only interested in going so far.
Most of the people don't realize that Elvis was not a drinker. He did not like alcohol. In fact, when I first went to work for him, there was no alcohol allowed in the house. I mean, no wine, no hard booze, no beer. And I come to find out over the years that it was because apparently a lot of his mother, Gladys, the Smith side, were a lot of drinkers. And he just didn't like that, didn't like people drunk.
For Elvis's part, he threw himself into this new endeavor with a zeal that few would have thought possible, given his status as the lightning rod of rock and roll rebellion. His scores on the preliminary aptitude tests earned him a place in the Fifth Army's coveted Tank Corps, known as Hell on Wheels. This was largely due to the advice of Colonel Tom Parker, who had told his young charge early on that the world would be watching his every move and that the best way to ensure his status upon leaving the service was to be the most gung-ho, spit-and-polished draftee the Army had ever seen. The Army, however, was still fighting to have Elvis placed in one of its special services units where his skills as an entertainer could be maximized to the Army's benefit. The fight went on until the 11th hour, with the Pentagon threatening to do as it pleased with its new recruit and the colonel stubbornly resisting the military at every turn. The battle over Private Presley finally ended when the colonel preemptively released photos and news information about Elvis's assignment to the Hell on Wheels battalion, stressing that Elvis was reveling in his new job. That effectively stopped the Army dead in its tracks, for it could not afford the outcry that would ensue if Presley were assigned to a cushy entertainment job after the banner headlines announcing his normal soldier status. And the Pentagon's top brass had to admit that they had been outmaneuvered by an honorary colonel in a straw hat and Hawaiian shirt. The first 8 weeks of Elvis's Army hitch began, as for all soldiers, with basic training. Once again, Elvis showed the world and the Army what he was made of by enduring the daily 5-mile hikes and various physical and mental challenges so well that by the end of it all, he had been lifted to the post of acting sergeant, the highest honor a draftee could receive during training.
That's how I met Elvis. I was at Fort Hood, and I went over, and I said, I'm Charlie Hodge. I was a lead singer with the Foggy River Board. And he said, hey, man, I used to watch you every Saturday night on TV, you know. And I think our friendship was a natural friendship, because when we met there at Fort Hood and got on the ship going to Europe, we knew the same people in the gospel field. We knew the same people in the country field. You know, like Wanda Jackson was on our show, and she was Miss Rockabilly. And Elvis always wanted to date her, you know. And so we had a lot to talk about.
Due to the rigorous training he was now undergoing, Elvis had not yet moved his friends and family out to Texas to join him, but he was not alone in the Lone Star State. Eddie Fadal, a Texas sports announcer who had emceed one of Presley's concerts in the mid-50s, now opened his home as a safe haven for America's most famous draftee.
Daddy reacquainted himself with Elvis a few months later here in Waco, Texas, when Elvis played a concert at the Heart of Texas Coliseum. And he went backstage to meet him, and he said, do you remember me? And lo and behold, Elvis had remembered him. And my father was always very generous, and he said, kind of off the cuff, come visit me sometime in my home. I'd love to have you. My wife would cook for you. We'd love to have you in our family. And it was just a standing offer. And in 1958, when Elvis became stationed at Killeen, Texas, he did just that. He would come visit our family on the weekends and just show up unexpectedly. He would never call first. He would just drop in. He would bring his friends, his entourage, his girlfriend at the time, Anita Wood, and pile in the house. And my mother, who, you know, would be running around in her robe and her house shoes or whatever, would suddenly run, go back and put a dress on and start cooking. There was never a dull moment at that time.
With his initial training complete, Elvis was now free to move his entourage into the home he had rented for them in nearby Killeen. True to form, Elvis reshaped his surroundings to suit his own individual tastes and needs. This meant that his favorite foods had to be on hand at any given hour, that entire rooms would have to be altered to resemble those in Graceland, and that the family atmosphere, which was so important to him, would have to be maintained. His off-base life now comfortable, Elvis set about the task of becoming a tank gunner, blasting his way to the top of his class and earning the right to be an instructor, a rare honor for a mere private. His happiness would be short-lived, however. After moving into the home in Killeen, Gladys Presley's health took an immediate turn for the worse. Though she had felt isolated within the columned splendor of Graceland, the flat, barren wasteland of south central Texas and the lonely hours away from Elvis only exacerbated her feelings of dread and despair. The Army had finally managed to sever what rock and roll could not. The umbilical cord between mother and son had begun to disintegrate, leaving Elvis a man and Gladys an emotional wreck. Vernon's personality did nothing to help her in her time of crisis, so Mrs. Presley turned to alcohol, drinking straight vodka to assuage her suffering. She had also begun to take high doses of amphetamines, which, in conjunction with her drinking, began to take a terrible toll on her health, both mentally and physically. She had long suspected that Vernon was seeing other women, and one night, in a drunken rage, she knocked him unconscious with an iron skillet. The emotional outburst caused her to collapse on her bed, where Elvis's friend Lamar Fike found her, her skin turning yellow, a sure sign of liver damage. After informing bodyguard Red West of the situation, the two then sat Elvis down to try and get him to transport his mother back to Memphis for treatment. Elvis refused. He had seen his mother in this state before. He had even found her drunk on more than one occasion. It was, he said, nothing new. And besides, he needed Mama in Texas. Gladys's health would soon cause even Elvis to rethink this idea. In early August 1958, Mrs. Presley's body could no longer take the strain it was being subjected to. She could no longer stand without assistance. Her skin took on a grayish-yellow tinge, and she was retaining so much fluid that it was causing unbearable pain in her right side. After seeing a local doctor, Gladys, accompanied by Vernon, was transported by train to Memphis, where she entered Methodist Hospital. Doctors drained 1.5 gallons of fluid from her abdomen, an indicator that her liver and kidneys were no longer functioning due to the damage caused by her heavy drinking. Back in Killeen, Elvis, who had not been able to secure a weekend pass, was racked with guilt over his apparent lack of interest in his mother's health and his enthusiastic pursuit of tank training. By August 11th, Gladys was drifting in and out of consciousness, repeatedly asking for Elvis. Elvis had requested an emergency leave, but in a callous move, the officer of the day denied that request on the grounds that Presley's mother wasn't dead yet. This sent Elvis into a frenzy, and he told his sergeant that he would go AWOL to get to his mother's side. Having wisely and calmly advised Elvis that the Army would likely jail him for his offense, his sergeant then told Elvis to have his mother's doctor call the base commander. Within 2 hours, he was on a plane to Memphis, while the officer who had denied his leave was disciplined. Elvis arrived at Memphis Methodist at 7:45 p.m. that night. His mother brightened up at the sight of her only son as they conversed in a baby talk language, with Gladys referring to Elvis as her whittle itty bitty and Elvis referring to his mother as his satnin. This form of communication was one that they had always shared and one that entirely excluded Vernon. Late that evening, Gladys ordered Elvis to go home and get some sleep. He protested, but his father agreed with his mother, and Elvis was sent home to rest. Elvis returned to Graceland and slipped out of his uniform and into bed, falling into a fitful sleep. At 3 a.m., the phone rang. Elvis knew what it was before his cousin Billy Smith took the call. Gladys Love Presley, the one person he could not live without, was gone. Her funeral would be one of the most traumatic events in Elvis's life. He grieved loudly, wailing over her lifeless body in the hospital, and later openly crying on the steps of Graceland with his father, in full view of the ever-present media. When her body was laid out in its coffin inside the stately mansion, Elvis spent hours massaging her feet, which he called her sooties, continuing their private language, even in death. The day of her burial, Elvis repeatedly said, "Everything I have is gone."
He was devastated when his mother died. I just can see him at the funeral home that day. He was just absolutely devastated. I've never seen anybody go through a death in the family that took it any harder than he did. And I'm sure he felt that he had lost his best friend, which she had been all of his life.
After his 30-day leave, Presley returned to Fort Hood a noticeably changed man. Though he had never been a boisterous soldier, he had always been gregarious. But his mother's death left him silent and withdrawn. Soon enough, he was ordered to ship out to Germany, where he would be stationed at the Army's base in Friedberg with Company D, 1st Battalion, 32nd Armored Division. It was a different Elvis Presley that faced the cameras on the eve of his departure.
Elvis, do the other soldiers give you a rough time because you're famous?
No, sir, I was very surprised. I've never met a better group of boys in my life. They probably would have if it'd been like everybody thought. I mean, everybody thought I wouldn't have to work and I would be given special treatment and this and that. But when they looked around and saw I was on KP and I was pulling guard and everything just like they were, well, they figured, well, he's just like us.
Elvis, you don't get out of the Army until 1960. If rock and roll should diminish in popularity or even disappear, what would you do?
Well, I would probably try acting. I mean, you know, I would try to make good as an actor, although it's a tough field to break into, acting, because you've got so much competition.
Elvis, what do you think about going to Germany?
Well, sir, I'm kind of looking forward to it. I mean, just before I came in the Army, we were planning a tour of Europe. And I got quite a bit of mail from over there and everything, you know, and I'm kind of looking forward to it, really.
On the way over to Germany on the ship, at night, I could hear Elvis start grieving sometimes at night, and I'd get out of my bunk and sit down and start talking to him and maybe joking with him a little bit, get him in a little better mood, and he'd drift off to sleep. And he said years later, he said, Charlie, said, it hadn't been you, said, you kept me sane all the way across the ocean.
He said when he went in the Army, I think he said he was on a ship and he could not show his feelings in front of the other guys. And he said at night, after everybody, he made sure everybody was asleep, he'd put all the pillows over his head and cry for the loss of his mom, because that was a very painful thing for him.
Upon his arrival in Germany, Elvis was greeted by the same pandemonium that had been his steady companion since 1956. 16-year-old Karl Heinz almost snagged the first European autograph from Presley on the gangplank of the troop ship. Though Elvis gamely tried to oblige, the duffel bag he carried was just too cumbersome, leaving him trying to write with his left hand. Presley and his fellow soldiers were whisked away as rapidly as possible by a troop train that would take them directly into the base. But Private Presley was still no normal soldier. Normal soldiers didn't require armed guards to get them to their barracks. In a replay of the firestorm of coverage that greeted his induction, the European media and fans now took their turn, not even allowing him the time to lie down on his bunk without it being cause for a photo op. Once again, Elvis handled the attention with the good humor he displayed back in the States. And once again, he transported his family and friends to his post to make himself feel as at home as possible.
Colonel Parker would never let Elvis appear on American Bandstand, certainly not for After Scale. I think it was $150 or something. Unbelievable. For that amount of money, he should have been on 2 or 3 times. But he did allow us to talk to him on the phone because he wanted to keep his audience aware of the fact that Elvis was recording and his music would be available. So we talked to him in Germany.
Hello, Elvis?
Hello, Rick, how are you?
Fine, thank you. Where on earth are you at this minute?
I'm in a little place called Germany.
Tell me a little bit about your activities. What did you do, say, today, for instance?
Mostly classroom work.
What do you study?
Map reading, and then I grease my Jeep and so forth, you know, just the routine.
Uh-huh. Do you have any time for music anymore?
Only at night. You see, I get off work at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and I have a guitar up here in the room, and I sit around, and, you know, up here. I don't want to get out of practice, you know, if I can help it.
I should hope not. Let me tell you some good news. I know by now you know why we're calling. In the annual American Bandstand Popularity Poll, you walked away once again with a couple of honors this year. The Favorite Male Vocalist Award and the Favorite Record of 1958 Award. The kids voted you top man all around.
That's really great, boy.
How about it? Do you miss home?
Oh, boy, you I can't hardly talk.
Well, Elvis, there's one thing, and I guess maybe our poll is an indication of it. The folks at home certainly haven't forgotten you. If anything, they're more and more interested in your activities and the things that you're doing and anxiously await your return.
Well, that's truly great, Dick. Believe me, that is the big thing that I'm looking forward to. You'll never know how happy that I'll be. I mean, I'm glad that I could come in the Army and do my part, you know. But you'll never know how happy I'll be, boy, when I can return to the entertainment world, because once you get a taste of show business, there's nothing like it.
You know it. Elvis, thank you ever so much for talking to us. We look forward to your return. We'll see you just as quick as we can all get together.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to say one more thing before you go.
Sure, please do.
Boy, I'm so excited I can't hardly talk, you know.
Take your time. We got all the time in the world.
I just to tell all those wonderful kids that they'll never know how happy that they made me, and just longing for the time when I can come back out and entertain them again and travel around and make movies and records and things like that, you know. Well, that's about it.
That's it.
Elvis next went through a press conference that one reporter said would be a shade smaller than President Eisenhower might expect to see if he came to Germany.
I was very surprised at the reception. I wasn't expecting anything quite that big. And I only regret that I didn't have more time to stay there with them. But maybe someday I can come back when my Army tour is up as an entertainer, and then I'll have more time, and maybe I'll have an opportunity to kind of make myself at home over here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Presley, and we wish you a pleasant stay in Germany.
Thank you very much. Arrivederci. Oh, that's Italian.
Soon afterward, Elvis was given permission to live off base with his family, who had been staying at a nearby hotel. With him in Germany were his father, Vernon, his grandmother, Minnie Mae, whom he called Dodger, and his perennial buddies, Red and Lamar. The motley group now found themselves thrust into a foreign culture, though none of them was particularly worldly. This would lead to problems during Elvis's stay in Europe. He and his entourage first stayed at a local hotel until they were thrown out due to Red and Lamar's pranks, which included setting paper on fire and shoving it under Elvis's door.
We had a few parties and things there and almost burnt down the hotel. One time we were playing a game and Elvis went in his bedroom and locked the door, and we piled the paper out there and set it on fire. We were going to burn him out of there. And so anyway, that's what got him out of that hotel.
They ultimately wound up in a house at 14 Goethestrasse, paying almost triple the usual rent for the relatively small house, once Frau Piper, the landlady, discovered just who her tenant would be. Frau Piper also refused to leave the premises, preferring instead to stay in the top floor of the house, much to the chagrin of Elvis's grandmother, who also had to share a kitchen with the cantankerous housefrau. Though Elvis was still an all-American boy, he now began to acclimate himself to his new, distinctly European surroundings. He also learned a new German word, probably the most important one he would learn during his stay there, Fräulein. And there were plenty of them for him to choose from. His German fans turned out to be no less obsessive than their American counterparts when it came to trying to meet their idol.
Elvis, I know probably you don't have too much time to yourself, but when you go out amongst the German people, what is the thing that strikes you as most interesting? Are they very different?
No. The difference is mostly the language barrier there. It's kind of hard to talk to most of them, especially the older ones, because a lot of them don't speak English at all, and I don't speak any German.
find the reaction of young people toward you, mainly the girls? Do they know who you are?
Well, it's, every day when I finish work and I come in, well, there's always a lot of people at the gate from all over Germany, you know. And they bring their families, especially on weekends. I have a lot of visitors here from all over Germany, all over Europe, in fact. They come here, you know, and take pictures and everything.
Elvis, I did want to thank you very much for calling on this day. As you probably know, this is our special anniversary day.
Oh, well, congratulations.
Many, many thanks, and we all look forward to your return.
Oh, thank you very much. You don't know how I'm looking forward to my return.
Thank you for calling, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Dick.
It was at this time that Elvis made a friend who would be with him for the rest of his life through the best and worst of times. A young soldier named Joe Esposito.
I would have never thought I'd meet Elvis. You know, there's millions of guys in the service. But it just so happened he came to the same base I was. I didn't meet him for the first, like, 6, 7 months, but I saw him around base in the morning. He'd drive by in this little BMW sports car that BMW let him use while he was over there, and he'd be always running late. He'd always come in late. His roll call was going on. And a friend of mine, Wes Daniels, the base photographer, was assigned to take pictures of Elvis for the Army. And one day he said, Joe, listen, we play football on the weekends and we need some more players this weekend. You want to come over and play football with Elvis and us guys? I said, yeah, I'd love to. And that's how I met Elvis.
Then, in the midst of it all, Private Elvis Aaron Presley was killed when his Mercedes crashed on the Autobahn. At least that's what the press reported. In fact, what had happened was that Vernon, in true form, had wrecked the car while driving Elvis's German secretary on an errand. Both ultimately recovered from their minor injuries, but it had left Elvis in the position of having to explain that the rumors of his death had been greatly exaggerated. And this wasn't Vernon's first mishap with the new Mercedes. 3 weeks before, he had almost caused an accident while trying to outrun reporters. In an attempt to cut them off from his son, he had inadvertently trapped the car on a railroad crossing with Elvis and Red in the passenger seats. Somehow the train missed them, as can be seen in the photos the reporters took that day. Private Presley also had to deal with the growing war at his rented house between Frau Piper and his grandmother over the use of the kitchen. It ended when Minnie May whacked Frau Piper with a broom. The women soon got drunk together and all was forgiven. Though Elvis was having domestic difficulties and had to deal with being on the front lines of the Cold War in Europe, there was time for him to have fun. He managed to get away for a night to be reunited with an old friend and rival, Bill Haley, at the Comets performance in Frankfurt.
We'd been to some show, and a guy stopped and he said, gee, he said, I'd just like to tell you, because Elvis always wore his uniform when going to leave. He said, I'd like to tell you that it's nice to see young men that will stay in the Army and be in the military for their country. He said, I think that's wonderful. He said, yes, sir. He said, thank you very much. He said, and he gave Elvis his name. He said, my name is so-and-so, and Elvis said, well, my name's Elvis Presley. And the guy took him by the hand and pulled it out with him in the light and said, by God, you are.
Elvis also managed to get out and enjoy European nightlife and all it had to offer. He went on a mini tour of the continent, starting first at the Moulin Rouge, the French-style nightclub in Munich. The pictures from one of those nights leave no doubt that it was good to be the king, or even to be just a friend of the king. The girls who were entertained by Elvis and his buddies were usually the entertainment. They were strippers. The Presley contingent made its way to Paris for some high-level carousing and nightclubbing, minus one member. Red West was sent back to the States due to his propensity for getting into brawls with the European locals.
Red had a short temper, and if you say something wrong, Red would just punch you out. Red got in a fight with this guy over there at this bar. It was bad. It got back to Elvis, you know, and he said this guy's causing a lot of problems. You know, he's going to be arrested and thrown in jail. So he went back home for that reason, and that's why he wasn't on the trip to Paris.
The rest, however, wound up enjoying a somewhat debauched 2 weeks, sampling all that Paris had to offer on a never-ending party at clubs like the Carousel, the Folies Bergère, the Crazy Horse, the Moulin Rouge, and the Lido. Like any American soldier on leave, Elvis and his friends enjoyed the company of the women who were available. This included those of the professional variety.
We all hung out at this nightclub. All the showgirls would meet us there, and we invited a lot of them to the hotel in the evening, and what can I tell you? You know, we did what young men would do at that age with beautiful ladies. But one of the guys was not having too much luck. So we were talking about it one day with Elvis. I said, well, let's get him a hooker. So I called down to the bellman, and I said, listen, you know, I told him the story. He said, okay, Mr. Esposito, no problem. So we're there, sitting around talking, having a good time, and knocking on the door comes in, this beautiful, beautiful blonde lady is at the door. She saw Elvis, and she ran over and just jumped all over him. Elvis said, no, 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 you're not here for me. You're here for him. She looked over and says, no, you. Well, we couldn't get her off of Elvis, so we had to ease her out the door and left. So it didn't work.
We really had a lot of fun. We had one incident where we were dating some of the showgirls in the Lido de Paris. And we was up in suite one afternoon, and we got a call from the guy at Lido and said, listen, said, you mind sending the girls over here? Said, we got to start the show in a few minutes.
Upon his return to Germany, Elvis took up where he had left off. He went through his duties as he always did, diligently and carefully. Elvis also kept up his charitable work with one of his favorite charities, the March of Dimes.
You know, so many kids and adults, too, have gotten just about one of the roughest breaks that can happen to a person. I'm talking about polio. Sure, we're on the way to conquering it thanks to the Salk vaccine. But take it from me, it sure isn't licked yet. Join the 1957 March of Dimes, please. It's very urgent.
And as he would throughout his life, he made sure he took care of his fans' desire to see him in person. Each day, he would come out of the front of the house and pose for photos with the girls, boys, parents, soldiers, and even pets that congregated there in anticipation of his arrival. He also signed hundreds, if not thousands, of autographs. Frau Piper even managed to make a side business out of his fans' desire to see and touch anything related to Presley. Although Elvis did tell her to please stop selling his clothes, as he would most likely be in need of them. He even introduced his German fans to American football by playing pickup games that included both soldiers and locals. But it was a fan from the United States whom Elvis met in Germany who was destined to have more impact on his life than any single person other than his beloved mother. Her name was Priscilla. Though she could not know it at the time, Anita Wood, whose faithfulness to her man was even put on record and released as a single on the Sun label, now had competition. Elvis also began indulging in two things during this time that would have alternating effects on his life and career. The first was karate, something he had been exposed to in his Army training and that had intrigued him on a mental and physical level. Presley continued studying the ancient art in Germany and began reading up on Eastern philosophy in an attempt to better understand the esoteric nature behind its disciplines. Eventually, Elvis would reach the level of 8th degree black belt and would continue his studies until his death. The second indulgence would have far darker consequences for the young superstar. He began taking Dexedrine, a powerful stimulant, to help him stay awake while on maneuvers and to boost his energy on nights out with his buddies.
Elvis was getting tired, and he asked, I forgot who it was, one of the sergeants. He says, you know, man, I'm tired. And the guy said, here, take this little white pill. It'll keep you awake. So he took it, and it woke him up. And if you ever take something like that, you'll understand. It really wakes you up. I mean, you get all this energy and everything. So he said, this is great. It's a prescription. It's a drug. I mean, it's not a off-the-street kind of drug. So he started taking those little by little. And as time went on, you know, he probably told somebody, say, listen, I don't know who it was, can you get me some of those pills? I'd like to have them with me in case I get tired and want to take them. Sure, give him a bottle. it's a good feeling. And we go out partying, and we go to Paris, and he took him, hey, try one of these, I'll stay up all night and take one of these. It was no big deal. It was not like we're taking something illegal or something was going to hurt us. That's how it all started.
The combination of amphetamines and the chronic insomnia that had plagued him since childhood were to wreak havoc on both his physical and mental health for the rest of Elvis's life. Presley also had a new crisis to deal with, which, typically, was once again the product of Vernon's actions. His father had started a love affair with a woman named Dee Stanley, an affair that flew in the face of Elvis's still raw grief over the death of his mother. To make matters worse, Stanley was a married woman with 3 children, whose husband was a sergeant stationed in Germany. Sergeant Bill Stanley was a decorated war hero who had stormed the beaches at Normandy during D-Day and had served as General George S. Patton's personal bodyguard. Facts which made Elvis all the more uncomfortable with his father's current flame. He told his father as much, but to no avail. When Vernon asked for his son's blessing to marry Dee, Elvis begrudgingly gave it. But things would never be the same. On top of all the pressures he was already dealing with, Hollywood now came calling to make sure that Elvis's return to the fold would be profitable for all involved. Producer Hal Wallace had come to Germany to film location footage for Elvis's first post-Army picture, GI Blues. Elvis found himself once again facing the criticism that he was getting special treatment due to his stature as an entertainer. He was also suffering from a bout of tonsillitis. With any other soldier, the painfully inflamed tonsils would be removed, and that would be the end of it. But with Elvis Presley, it was decided that the risk of damaging his million-dollar voice was one that the Army would not be willing to take on his behalf. He therefore had to tough it out and allow his tonsillitis to run its course. So much for special treatment. After his recovery, he and his friends managed to get to France to enjoy the nightlife of the Paris clubs one last time. Naturally, Elvis footed the bill. He could afford it. The Army had just announced that Elvis Presley had been promoted to sergeant, giving him a pay raise of $22.94 in the process.
We stayed at the Prince de Galles Hotel. And there was one time that one of the soldiers was talking to this girl. But one of the people that was in the show come over and said Elvis said, that soldier, that's not a girl he's with, that's a man in drag. And so Elvis went over and said, look, Ace, now don't get excited. Just get up and leave. Said, that's not a girl that you're having a drink with, that's a man. And so he said, really, Elvis? He said, yeah. I said, don't cause a scene, just get up and leave. And Elvis went back and sat down, and the guy got up and left.
Things were beginning to wind down for Elvis as his stay in Germany was coming to an end. He took part in what was to be his last military exercise as the commander of his 3-man team for Operation Winter Shield. He also began to prepare for what was to be a long and arduous journey back home. First, he had to say goodbye to the various friends and fans that continued to gather at his rented home.
Hello, Elvis? Hello? Hi, we had no idea we could catch a hold of you today. Oh, I just came in the door, Dick. What is the situation regarding your release from the Army? Do you have any word on it? Not anything definite, Dick. The way it stands now, I leave Germany somewhere between the 20th of February and the 2nd of March. When you come back, I understand you've got a television show with Frank Sinatra and a few movies to make. How are you going to squeeze them all in? Well, I'm full of Carl Parker. We'll have everything arranged. I know the first picture is GI Blues, but I don't know exactly when the television show will be. Elvis, I want to thank you very, very much for taking the time out from your busy schedule to reassure you once again that we're all awaiting your arrival back home, and on this day to wish you a happy birthday. Thanks a lot, Dick, and tell everybody else for me. Will do. Bye-bye.
The press also had their turn with Sergeant Presley at a press conference arranged by the Army.
An international crowd of reporters and photographers from all major news outlets in Germany arrive at Ray Barracks, Friedberg, for a special press conference. The most famous enlisted man in USAREUR during the last year and a half is about to go back to his millions of fans. Because he has been almost completely away from singing and acting while in the Army, reporters have plenty of questions about the future to ask Sergeant Elvis Presley.
There was no way they were going to miss an opportunity to get their most successful marketing tool ever in front of the cameras one last time.
When asked by a Screen Digest interviewer if his military experience has been beneficial to him in any way, Elvis said,
"It's been a big help in both my career and on my personal life, because I've learned a lot. I made a lot of friends that I never would have made otherwise, and I've had a lot of good experiences and some bad ones, naturally. It's good to rough it, to put yourself to a test, to see if you can take it, and see if you can stand upon it."
Another thing we hear a lot about in the Army, especially here, is that we are not only soldiers but goodwill ambassadors.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
Well, it's definite. It stands to reason, because we are in a foreign country, and what we do here will reflect on America and our way of life.
Photographers move in to get that one last picture. An attractive girl reporter gets a kiss, and then an encore as the flash bulbs pop. Elvis has only one day of processing before leaving USAREUR. He takes with him many good memories and pride in his military service.
Ironically, he ran into his old supporter from Sun Records, Marion Kesker, who was herself serving in the Air Force at this time.
The one thing that every GI has is the right to bitch. You gotta complain all the time or you're not a real GI. Elvis couldn't do this, because if Elvis had said one single word about even ordinary run-of-the-mill complaint, which from his best buddy would have been acceptable and expected, somebody would have sure gotten it to the press.
After 18 months away, Elvis now waited to board a plane that would carry him back to civilian life. As he strode up the steps looking resplendent in his dress uniform, a clutch of fans and friends waved goodbye. For some, it would be the last time they would see their idol in the flesh. For one, it was only the beginning of the story. The plane touched down at Fort Dix, New Jersey, and Elvis emerged into a snowstorm, both literally and figuratively. The photographers clicked away as Nancy Sinatra welcomed Elvis home on behalf of her father. And as Elvis was handed his discharge papers and his mustering out pay of $109.54. He also went through yet another press conference.
Elvis, do you feel that you're a little old for the teenagers now?
That's the first time I've been asked that one. I don't know. I don't feel too old. I can still move around pretty good.
Are you apprehensive about what must be a comeback?
Yes, I am. I mean, I have my doubts. You know, I'm not gonna commit myself in saying that I'm gonna do this or I'm gonna do that, because I don't know actually. The only thing I can say is that I'm going to try. I'll be in there fighting.
Now that you're about to be discharged from the Army, Elvis, have 2 years of sobering Army life changed your mind about rock and roll?
Sobering Army life? No, it hasn't. It hasn't changed my mind, because I was in tanks for a long time, you see. And they rock and roll quite a bit.
And then, suddenly, Elvis Aaron Presley was once again a civilian. He left that day with Colonel Tom Parker to board a train that would take him back to Memphis. At each stop along the way, he was greeted by throngs of fans in an outpouring of emotion that made him feel more secure about his future in the entertainment industry. Colonel Parker had done his job well.
Helped his image tremendously being in the Army. Before Elvis went into service, the adults were putting Elvis down, you know, all the goody two-shoe people out there were saying how evil Elvis was and the devil's music. But after he came out, it all changed. He served his 2 years like any other GI, was out there in the field, in the mud, and he got a lot of respect after that.
As the train pulled into Memphis, the fans were once again waiting. Elvis leapt off the train and into the waiting crowd, signing autographs and chatting with the girls. Soon he was whisked away in a police car with sirens blaring. The world that Presley found was a different one than he had left. Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper had died in a plane crash. Jerry Lee Lewis had married his cousin and wrecked his career. Chuck Berry was in jail on a sex charge. And Little Richard had become a Baptist preacher railing against the devil's music. For his part, Elvis was to do a welcome home special with Frank Sinatra and the Rat Pack in Miami.
Here's the star of our show, Elvis Presley.
As the police convoy approached Graceland, the gates swung open, enfolding the king of rock and roll as he entered his palace, once again a free man. The 50s were over.